In this lecture, I'm going to explain the basic concepts behind creating an encounter-based story world. In the subsequent lecture, I'll lay out a complete step-by-step plan for actually building such a story world. Explaining these concepts in a short video requires a certain amount of, shall we say, simplification. Now, the first and most important consideration is having a clear idea of what you want to accomplish. One of my basic laws of software design is, if you don't know where you're going, you probably won't get there. Here's a second fundamental principle. A story world is not a dramatized game, or a storified game, or a game with a story bolted onto it. A story world generates a dramatically significant story through its interaction with the player protagonist, and as such it is profoundly different from a game. Here's an example of how badly we misunderstand the difference between games and stories. We all know that a story is experienced in strictly linear form, whereas a game presents something like a branching tree. For decades, this is the way that I thought about the difference between stories and games. Only after many years did I realize that this linear versus branching approach is not the most useful way to think about that difference. A more illuminating way to perceive the difference between stories and games is to think about how they communicate their messages. At its heart, the fundamental information content of a game is that it teaches you how to win. It does so in a series of tiny steps comprising something called the learning curve. Each step presents a slightly more difficult version of the challenge of the game. In effect, even the most action-packed game is, in essence, a puzzle. The player must figure out the techniques required to win. The conceptual structure of a story is much more complex than that of a game. The parts of the story are presented at different times and not necessarily in logical order, and the relationships among those parts are never clear when first seen. Only at the very end of the story do all the pieces come together. Imagine going to the theater to watch a movie, but the projector breaks down 5 minutes before the end of the movie. The manager offers you a refund. Do they owe you, say, a 5% refund based on the fact that you did see 95% of the movie? Or would you demand a 100% refund because without the ending, you really didn't get the story? Consider all the relationships, personalities, and expectations of the main characters in The Lord of the Rings. It's a complex network. Do you remember this moment in the movie? This was one of the emotional high points of those movies because it brought together all the sacrifices and struggles that had brought Frodo to this point. These are radically different conceptual structures. Don't ever forget that. I'd like now to coin a term, moment of convergence. It refers to what is often known as the crisis in story architecture. My only intent in coining a new term for that which we already have a similar term is to emphasize the fact that all the pieces of the story come together at the moment of convergence. This term emphasizes the information content of the story. The moment of convergence in the first Matrix movie comes when Neo realizes his potential and so can stop bullets in midair. Other stories have their own moments of convergence. In Arrival, it comes when Louise realizes that she must telephone the Chinese general. In Brave, it comes when Merida realizes how selfish she has been. In Stage Beauty, it comes when Kinniston finds the true actor within himself. The moment of convergence is central to stories and non-existent in games. Let's move on. Here's a great German word, Weltanschauung. It means something like worldview or conception of reality or overall outlook. Mr. Trump's followers have a Weltanschauung that perceives reality as a collection of bad people determined to steal from, enslave, or humiliate you. The people on the far left have their own Weltanschauung that sees the world in terms of the oppression of minorities. Gamers have their Weltanschauung too, and it includes many unconscious assumptions that gamers never even notice. They see these assumptions as the fundamental reality of games. Storytellers have their own Weltanschauung too, but it is based on concepts utterly alien to those of the gamer Weltanschauung. For example, consider the perception of time in games. It is continuous, either flowing smoothly, as in a real-time game, or taking steps called turns. In both cases, time is continuous. But in stories, time jumps. Sometimes time moves slowly, and sometimes it skips over hours, days, or even years. In Lord of the Rings, people walk for months and months over vast distances, but we see only a few snippets of all that walking, with the movie simply skipping over those long periods of time. That's because it would be boring to watch all that walking. An even better example of this is the movie Arrival, in which time jumps forward and backward. All of this jumping around is confusing at first. Only at the end of the movie do the pieces come together so that the entire sequence makes sense. Here's another difference between games and stories. Again, this is absolutely fundamental. Games are about things, not people. You gather things, pick them up, drop them, acquire them, use them. It's always things. Yes, games do have cardboard people, but they're little dolls that nobody would take seriously as characters in a story. I suffered from the game's Weltanschauung in designing Le Mort d'Arthur. I just assumed, as part of the game's Weltanschauung, that the game had to end with the player protagonist either winning or losing. Le Mort d'Arthur has a win or lose ending. It's literally black or white. I now realize that Le Mort d'Arthur would be better with additional endings that aren't so damned Boolean. I shall be correcting this blunder in a second edition of Le Mort d'Arthur. But remember this lesson. We are all vulnerable to making mistakes because of our unconscious assumptions arising from the gamer Weltanschauung. In my next lecture, I will present a step-by-step procedure for building an encounter-based story world. Stay tuned.